I met his gaze, refusing to back down. "We just got here." "Now, Eve," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I turned back to Leo, offering him a polite smile. "It was nice talking to you." Leo nodded, his eyes flicking between Jason and me with a knowing look. "Likewise. Take care, Mrs. Coleman." As Jason dragged me out of the event, I could feel the anger brimming in him, and it scared me. What if he got violent with me? Back in the suite, the moment we stepped inside, Jason exploded. "What the hell were you thinking?" he yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. I stood my ground, although I was scared to my bones. The look on his face was enough to get anyone terrified. "What do you mean, Dot?" I muttered, unsure of how to respond to the question. He stalked towards me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Eve. Leo Blackwood is dangerous. He uses gullible people like you to accomplish his devilish goals." Maybe I shot back. "Jason, you aren't anything different. The last time I checked, you're also using me." His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist and pulling me close. His grip was tight, almost painful, but I didn't flinch. "I do not care about what you think about me, Eve. I never forced you to sign the contract at the beginning." I met his gaze, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. "You didn't force me, but you tricked me. You lured me into this. You are definitely worse than Leo Blackwood." For a moment, we were locked in a battle of wills, our faces inches apart, the tension between us crackling like electricity. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war he was waging within himself. But I refused to let him know that I was scared and was only pretending not to be intimidated by him. Finally, he released my wrist, shoving me away with a curse. "You disgust me, Eve. I wish I never had to choose someone as despicable as you are." I watched him walk away, my heart racing, my emotions a chaotic mess. This was a dangerous game we were playing, and I knew it. I had never planned to get him angry. He looked brutal when he wasn't angry. Getting him angry seemed like I was signing my death warrant. The days passed in a blur of monotony, and I had long since accepted my fate. The initial shock, the anger, the hurt, they were all still there, but buried deep. There was no point in dwelling on them. I had 2 months to get through, and I'd be damned if I spent them fighting a losing battle. Jason was cold, distant, and mean, and that was that. There was no love lost between us, and I wasn't about to waste my energy trying to change him. Every morning was the same. He left early for the office, barely acknowledging me, and returned late at night, exhausted and irritable. I made myself as invisible as possible, sticking to the agreed-upon terms of our contract. No intimacy, no scandal, no interference in each other's lives. We were married in name only, and I had no intention of pretending otherwise. One morning, as I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, I realized how much I had distanced myself from everything that once mattered to me. I hadn't spoken to my parents in weeks, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say. They were thrilled with the financial security this marriage brought them, and I couldn't bear to shatter their happiness by admitting how miserable I was. But as much as I wanted to reach out to them, I knew it wouldn't change anything. This was my reality, and I had to deal with it on my own. There was no going back, no undoing what had already been done. I had made my bed, and now I had to lie in it. Later that day, as I wandered around the empty mansion, I thought about what my life would look like after the 2 months were up. Jason would be out of my life for good, and I'd have enough money to live comfortably, far away from the mess this marriage had become. I imagined myself in a small, cozy apartment, living quietly and peacefully, free from the coldness that surrounded me here. But there was something about that vision that felt hollow. It wasn't that I missed the idea of being married to Jason, I didn't. But I missed the sense of purpose, the drive I used to have before all of this. I had once been a woman with dreams, with ambitions, and now I was just waiting. Waiting for time to pass, waiting for this chapter of my life to end. That evening, when Jason returned, I greeted him with the usual indifference, and he barely acknowledged me as he headed to his study. I knew better than to follow him or ask how his day had been. We lived like strangers, and I was content to keep it that way. But as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace, I made a decision. I wasn't going to waste the next few weeks just waiting for them to end. I would make use of the time I had, focus on myself, and start planning for the future I wanted. I didn't need Jason's approval or his attention. The following days passed in a strange, unsettling quiet. The kind of quietness that crept into your bones, making you feel uneasy, like something was about to change, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. Jason and I continued to avoid each other, our paths crossing only when absolutely necessary. Yet, the atmosphere in the mansion felt different, almost charged, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to break. I began spending more time outside, walking through the gardens that surrounded the mansion. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and the solitude gave me space to think. I realized that while I had been focusing on enduring these 2 months, I had stopped living. I had given up on everything that mattered to me, letting my dreams and ambitions wither away. But now I felt a stirring inside me, a flicker of the old determination I once had. As I was walking one afternoon, I noticed Jason watching me from his study window. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his gaze made my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but the image of him standing there, staring at me, lingered in my mind. That evening, as I prepared to retreat to my room after dinner, Jason spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "Eve, wait." I froze, surprised by the unexpected address. It was the first time in days that he had initiated a conversation. I turned to face him, keeping my expression neutral. "Yes." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if he was unsure of what to say next. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected another fight, another round of biting remarks, not this. I didn't know how to respond. Was I happy? The answer was obvious, but admitting it felt like giving him some sort of power over me. Instead of answering directly, I asked, "Why do you care?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I don't. It's just, you seem different." I narrowed my eyes at him, searching for any hidden motives behind his words. Jason was not the kind of man to ask such personal questions without a reason. Different how? He looked away, avoiding my gaze. I don't know. Less annoying. A small, bitter laugh escaped me. Less annoying? That's rich coming from you. He smirked, the tension between us easing slightly. Maybe, but still, I'm curious. Curiosity killed the cat, Jason, I shot back, but there was no malice in my tone, just a tired acceptance of our situation. I turned to leave, but his next words stopped me in my tracks. I miss it, you know. I slowly turned back to him, my brows furrowing in confusion. Miss what? He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than anger or indifference in his eyes. The fights. The arguments. At least then, there was something alive between us. I felt a strange flutter in my chest at his words, a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite name. Are you saying you miss fighting with me? His lips curved into a faint, almost rueful smile. Maybe. It's better than this silence, isn't it? I didn't know how to respond to that. Jason had always been a mystery to me, a man of contradictions. But this admission, this unexpected vulnerability, made me see him in a slightly different light. It was the first time he had hinted that our interactions, no matter how volatile, meant something to him. I took a step closer, testing the waters. So, what do you suggest we do? Go back to arguing like we did before? His smile widened, the tension between us shifting into something almost playful. Maybe not the arguing part, but the fire that I wouldn't mind seeing again. A strange, tentative truce formed between us after that night. We didn't go back to the cold indifference that had defined our days. Instead, we found ourselves engaging in more conversations, albeit still laced with sarcasm and occasional barbs. But there was a difference now, an undercurrent of something warmer, something that neither of us was willing to acknowledge just yet. The fights returned, but they were different this time. Less about tearing each other down and more about testing boundaries, pushing buttons to see how far we could go. And strangely, I found myself looking forward to them. The quiet animosity was gone, replaced by a more familiar, almost comforting tension. Jason, too, seemed to miss our verbal sparring. He would deliberately provoke me, saying things he knew would rile me up, just to see the fire in my eyes. And I played along, giving as good as I got, because in those moments, I felt like myself again. The woman who didn't back down, who fought for what she wanted. One evening, after a particularly heated exchange, we found ourselves standing in the kitchen, both of us breathing hard, our faces flushed with the thrill of the argument. Jason was leaning against the counter, a smug grin on his face, while I stood opposite him, my arms crossed, trying to hide my own satisfaction. You know, he said, his voice low and teasing, you're almost enjoyable when you're mad. I rolled my eyes, but there was no real heat behind it. And you're less insufferable when you're not trying to be an ass. He chuckled, and for a brief moment, our gazes locked, the air between us thick with an unspoken understanding. There was something undeniably addictive about these moments, something that neither of us could deny. As the days continued to pass, I began to notice a shift in my feelings. I no longer dreaded Jason's presence. In fact, there were times when I found myself looking forward to our interactions, anticipating what new argument or sarcastic remark he would throw my way. It was dangerous, this new dynamic between us, but I couldn't help it. And then, one night, everything changed. I was in the living room, curled up with a book, when Jason walked in. He had that same intense look in his eyes, the one that made my heart race, but there was something else this time. Something different. He walked over to the fireplace, staring into the flames for a long moment before turning to me. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if things were different between us?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost contemplative. I looked up at him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he walked over to the couch and sat down next to me. "If we weren't stuck in this contract, if we weren't constantly at each other's throats." I studied his face, trying to gauge his thoughts. This was a side of Jason I hadn't seen before, a side that made me wonder if there was more to him than the cold, distant man I had come to know. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I guess I've never really thought about it." He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Neither have I. Until now." One evening, after a particularly tense exchange over dinner, Jason suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up, his expression unreadable. He looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't help but notice the way his gaze softened just slightly, as if he was seeing me in a way he hadn't before. "I'm going out for a while," he announced abruptly, his voice tight. "Don't wait up." Before I could respond, he was already walking out the door, leaving me alone in the empty dining room with my thoughts swirling. I stared after him, a sense of unease settling over me. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of emotion that I couldn't quite name. And for the first time in weeks, I found myself wondering where he was going and why he had left so suddenly. Hours passed, and the mansion seemed to grow colder, the silence oppressive. I tried to distract myself with a book, with television, but nothing could shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Jason's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but feel that this time, things were different. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and I didn't know if it would end in another fight or something far more dangerous. Unable to take the silence any longer, I decided to go for a walk. The garden, usually a place of solace, felt eerie under the pale moonlight, the shadows long and foreboding. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety, each step taking me further into the labyrinth of emotions I had been trying so hard to ignore. As I rounded a corner, I stopped in my tracks. Jason was standing at the far edge of the garden, his back to me, his posture tense. He wasn't alone. Leo Blackwood was with him. My heart lurched in my chest, and I instinctively stepped back, pressing myself against the wall of the mansion, hidden in the shadows. From this distance, I couldn't hear their conversation, but the intensity of their body language was enough to tell me that this was no friendly chat. Jason's fists were clenched at his sides, and Leo's expression was cold, calculating. The two men exchanged a few more words, and then, to my utter shock, Jason suddenly grabbed Leo by the collar, shoving him back against the wrought iron gate. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, my mind racing with questions. What was Jason doing? Why was he confronting Leah like this? And more importantly, what did this mean for me? Just as I was about to step out from my hiding spot, ready to intervene or at least demand answers, something in Jason's stance changed. His grip on Leo loosened, and he stepped back, a look of grim resignation on his face. Leo straightened his jacket, smirking as if he had just won some unspoken battle. He said something that made Jason stiffen, his expression darkening. Then, without another word, Leo turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jason remained where he was, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. I could see the tension radiating off him, the turmoil he was trying so hard to conceal. I was about to move, to approach him, when Jason suddenly turned and stormed back towards the mansion. Panic surged through me, and I ducked back into the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear his footsteps approaching, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't ready to face him, not after what I had just seen. Not with the questions burning in my mind. But before I could slip away, Jason rounded the corner and stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto mine. "Eve," he breathed, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you doing out here?"